These days, it's vanishingly rare for anything really new to come to light about one of the most famous incidents in World War II, unless somebody's found some recently declassified or misfiled note stuffed somewhere down the back of a dusty archive. Particularly when it comes to the sinking of HMS Hood. Reams and reams of paper have been used in various books and articles about it. Pretty much everybody who saw what happened has been interviewed time and time again, particularly, of course, the 3 survivors from HMS Hood. But since it's been a little over 84 years since the destruction of the ship, even the youngest members of the crews aboard the various ships involved in the action would be well over 100 these days. And therefore it's not exactly a surprise that all 3 survivors of HMS Hood passed on some time ago. But recently, I was afforded the opportunity to look at a document that is actually a genuinely new perspective on that incident. And it comes from someone who is, at least at the time of publication, still alive. Although a sprightly 108, Len West was actually serving aboard HMS Prince of Wales during the Battle of Denmark Strait, and he put down his memories in a letter relatively recently, which his son then sent off. Now, this letter didn't come to me, it was actually sent to the Britain at War magazine. However, I've contributed a couple of pieces and a few commentaries to Britain at War, and I have a good relationship with them. Therefore, when they saw that, hey, there's actually new information about the sinking of Hood, and they knew, well, there's this naval historian chap who we occasionally correspond with, they were exceptionally kind in sending me a copy of the letter for comment and checking before it went to publication, and both the letter and my commentary are now available in the latest edition of Britain at War. More on that later. But today, I'm going to point out a few highlights from that letter and explain how it either illustrates the nature of the war at the time, how it perhaps sheds new light on what's going on, or perhaps how it verifies or clarifies information that we already had. Because believe me, this letter, although a lot of it might sound familiar to those of you who are students of Hood's destruction, does actually help quite a bit in understanding what exactly was going on. But just a quick mention on who is actually giving us this account. Len West was one of 5 brothers who served in the Second World War, 2 in the Army, 1 in the Home Guard, and 2 in the Navy. He was the 4th son, and the 4th and 5th sons went into the Navy. The first 2 went in the Army, and the middle one, the 3rd, went into the Home Guard. And somehow, by sheer luck or divine providence, all 5 brothers survived, as did their 3 brothers-in-law, which was a remarkable enough feat that in the 16th of January 1946 edition of the Eastbourne Gazette, this actually made front-page headlines. So our account picks up on May the 21st, 1941, when Prince of Wales is at anchor in Scapa Flow, and Len West notes that in the evening, over the ship's internal broadcast system, but they were ordered both watches fall in to prepare for sea. Now, at that point, they didn't know, that is the regular sailors on the ship, what on earth was going on, other than they were being ordered to sea. Although, as he notes, King George V, Victorious and Hood were constantly exchanging signals, which makes sense because, of course, King George V was where Admiral Tovey was, Hood was the flagship of Admiral Holland, and Victorious, being a brand new carrier, may or may not have been assigned to the force. Obviously, as it turned out, Hood and Prince of Wales were the ones that were sent to sea. They headed out, and he also then notes that the chief rumour going through the lower decks was that Hood and Prince of Wales were part of a bombarding force for an attempted invasion of the continent. Now, that might seem a little bit ridiculous to those of us looking back at World War II now, early 1941. Of course, Britain's not going to be invading Europe at that stage, having just about managed the Dunkirk evacuation less than a year earlier, but this is a reflection of what it was like to actually be there. It's very easy for us these days to think, oh yes, well, this is such a big important battle. Surely everyone knew that what was going on. No, this was a lot of operational secrecy. All the men knew was they're being ordered out of port at fairly short notice. Where they're going and what they're supposed to be doing, They have no idea, which is basic operational security, to be perfectly honest. But they were briefed the next morning by Captain Leach once the ship was at sea, and they were told that they were going after Bismarck. And also, in accordance with Admiral Holland's plan, he notes that they were told that ideally they were going to be intercepting Bismarck and Prince Eugen somewhere just after Friday midnight, because remember, the original plan was for a night attack at close range. Now, we fast forward to May 24th, and we get a little bit of a view from the decks, as it were. He notes that the crew of Prince of Wales were actually in very high spirits. I mean, obviously, it's the biggest capital ship in the world at the time, and a brand new fast battleship up against a battleship and a heavy cruiser, and they've got Norfolk and Suffolk in support. You can understand why they're going to be quite confident. Plus, they've got some destroyers at this stage. When Friday midnight comes, Prince of Wales goes to action stations. They're closed up, so they can't wander around the ship, but they are allowed to sleep at their station so that they're as fresh and ready as they can be when action is finally joined. Now, of course, as we know, the nighttime interception doesn't come off, and as the dawn breaks, we get a very interesting note, as he says, as it became lighter, we noticed it was like an Arctic winter's day. It had been snowing, and the sky was overcast, and the seas were in their fury. This is actually really, really helpful, because outside of some fairly low-res video imaging from Prince Eugen, and one or two, again, fairly low-res snaps taken on the day, we don't have any visual record of what the weather was like, and questions around what actually was the weather like usually end up referring to the ship's logs. Obviously, the logs for Prince of Wales in the British case, because the weather can vary quite a bit at the distances that we're talking about between the British and German formations. And Prince of Wales's log is relatively sparse on the details for the weather of that morning. But this helps clarify the weather as experienced on that morning, particularly with relation to the sea state, which obviously is not recorded as, it was sea state 6 or whatever, but that the seas were pretty darn active, which means that, if you're doing reproductions of the Battle of Denmark Strait, you have to account for that in your depictions in order to be accurate. And it does also help to explain the nature of some of the engagement as time went on. Now, to be fair, you probably could have deduced most of those weather conditions from previous sources, but you would have had to put together a number of different sources and made a little bit of interpolation, whereas this is nice, concise, and literally from the deck view. Now, for those of you who are interested, the action station that Len West was assigned to appears to be with the pom-pom array. At the time of the Battle of Denmark Strait, Prince of Wales was equipped with 4 octuple pom-poms, and these were mounted in pairs on a platform either side of the forward mast, which was part of the forward superstructure, but just behind the main bridge tower itself. And this was quite handy, as of course it afforded Len a good view of the Germans, if he was on the starboard side, but by simply taking a few paces across, basically going underneath the tripod foremast and behind the bridge tower, he could then end up on the port side of the pom-pom platform, which meant he could get a good view of Hood. And after seeing both sides open fire, that's where he decided to go and watch Hood fire, because, well, sticking your head around the bridge tower to watch Prince of Wales's guns fire would have involved essentially stepping in front of a 40mm pom-pom, which, given they're all action stations, wasn't really going to be something he'd get away with. And now we come into Hood's last couple of minutes, and here is a few very important bits of information. Now, you'll note from the video I did on how HMS Hood was destroyed, my theory is that HMS Hood was destroyed before she could begin the final turn that she had a signal flag flying for. There's a whole host of reasons for that, which are explained in the video itself, but suffice to say that some people with, shall we say, very entrenched views about what happened to Hood have given me an awful lot of grief for that over the past few years, because they are obsessed with the belief, for whatever reason, again, I'm not going to go into that argument here, that Hood was partway through her turn. Now, obviously, I believe the evidence completely rules that out, but nonetheless, how about we go over to Len, because he actually watched the whole thing happen. So I'm going to quote directly from here. And he says, "I saw a salvo fall just astern and over Hood. I thought that was a close one. I expected her to alter course, but she didn't. And another salvo fell short and ahead. It was pretty good gunnery, I thought." So this is essentially the last minute of Hood's life, and Len watches two salvos land very close to Hood, one slightly behind, one slightly ahead. And he, as he notes, he expects Hood to change course, perhaps, but very specifically notes she doesn't. She is still on course at this point. And, well, at this point in the account, we're a couple of seconds from that fatal blow. So, taking up the account again, a few seconds later, I saw two shell splashes astern of Hood, and I expected the rest of that salvo to fall astern, but the shells didn't. Suddenly, out of the ventilators, flames began to spurt. I thought it was just a small fire caused by an exploding shell. Up to this time, we had escaped damage. But we had inflicted damage on Prince Eugen. This is obviously what the Prince of Wales's crew thought. Hood's guns were elevating for their next salvo. They belched flame and smoke. Me and my mates were dumbfounded. No sooner had she fired when I got the biggest shock of my life. There was a tremendous explosion. Hood was hidden from view by smoke and flames. Now, this is really interesting because we can compare this with the account from Captain Leach aboard HMS Prince of Wales, who at this stage in proceedings is maybe 20 feet forward of Len and probably 20 to 30 feet higher up on the bridge, and also gives us a very useful lesson in perspective, because Captain Leach notes that two shells from Bismarck's final salvo do land slightly short of Hood, and one slightly over, but then obviously the fourth shell, although I don't know which shell in sequence it actually was, but let's say for sake of argument the fourth shell is the one that hits Hood, and that's the one obviously you don't see an impact in the sea for. Or more accurately, you don't see the explosion of the shell causing a massive plume of water in the sea, because the actual impact of the shell in the grand scheme of things would have been fairly minor. Now, Len's account, he only sees two shells explode in the sea, sending up plumes of water, and he thinks they're slightly astern of Hood. He doesn't report the third shell, which Leach does, exploding over Hood on the far side, and of course then he sees Hood begin to explode. Now, why did I say this is a good lesson in perspective? Well, remember, although their relative bearing to Hood is about the same, the difference in the minor details of this account are almost certainly to do with the difference in elevation. Now, Len is, to be fair, somewhat above Prince of Wales's main deck on the pom-pom platform, but Leach is even higher. So I think, in order to synchronize the two accounts, what's happening is both men see the two shells that fall slightly short of Hood. Now, of course, Len's perspective, he thinks perhaps they're somewhat astern. From Leach's perspective, they're abreast of Hood. That's human perspective for you. When it comes to the shell that went over Hood and impacted just on the port side of her, I think what's happening there is Leach's point of view being somewhat higher up and having perhaps a broader scope of view from the bridge means that he's probably seen the top of that plume, whereas slightly lower down, I think from Len's perspective, probably what's happening is that Hood's bulk is shielding the majority of the plume from his view, and as a result, he's not registering it. So theoretically, if you were in his position and you were looking for it, you might have seen the very top of the plume come up behind Hood's superstructure, but obviously in the heat of the moment, it's understandable that he didn't notice that. We also get an interesting short timeline in that the fire around the ventilators, the kind of blowtorch-like flame that Leach reports, that happens. Then Hood's guns fire, and he doesn't say exactly whether this is the forward guns or all the guns, because there are some conflicting accounts from other people aboard Prince of Wales as to whether or not the aft guns actually fired just before Hood detonated. But what we do find out is that right after that firing, whether it involved 4, 6 or 8 guns, that's when the massive explosion takes place. Now go on to the next bit. He says, one of my mates pointed and said, she's all right. I looked and saw Hood's forecastle emerge from the smoke, and naturally I also thought she was all right, and that the explosion was due to an upper deck higher angle ammunition locker exploding. So that'd be the 4-inch magazines, or 4-inch ready-use lockers more precisely. But my thoughts were dashed when her bow started lifting in the air and slowly slipped under the surface. Again, this correlates very well with both other observers on Prince of Wales and the survivors aboard HMS Hood, because after that big explosion, the first thing that is reported on Hood's bridge is not there's been a massive explosion, but that there's been a loss of steering. And everybody's a little perplexed as to why. And then Hood starts to roll somewhat one way, and then she starts to roll somewhat the other way, and it's only really in the second roll, and as the ship starts to pitch, that it really becomes clear on Hood's bridge that she has in fact been fatally struck. And interestingly, that amount of time does just about allow for another famous thing that's noted about Hood sinking, which is that as she goes down, people witness the bow turrets firing, or at least some of them do. It's not mentioned in this account. But the fact that there's the explosion and Hood has enough time to at least have a good chunk of her emerge from the explosion pool, as witnessed by Len, and as we just described from the perspective on Hood, it takes a while for everybody to notice that something's gone horribly wrong. That does suggest that enough time has passed for the forward gun crews, who, as we noted, have fired a little bit before the explosion has occurred, to probably just about have gotten the next salvo locked and loaded before it becomes very clear to them that something has gone horribly wrong. Because bear in mind, when you're shut up in the turret, you're going to have even less of an idea of what's going on outside than the people on Hood's bridge, who could at least see generally what angle of roll and heel Hood had achieved, whereas in the turret, you'd have to actually start pitching and rolling quite heavily before people notice that something was out of the ordinary. And Len then goes on to note, obviously, Prince of Wales takes avoiding action so that she doesn't run into the wreckage of Hood. And then, of course, the bridge of Prince of Wales is hit. Now, Len records this as an explosion. We know that the shell of Bismarck that hit the bridge doesn't actually explode, but hey, it's an over 1-ton shell screaming in at supersonic velocities that's just punched straight through the bridge tower and out the other side. The effects for anybody stationed on the pom-pom deck are going to be near enough indistinguishable from a decent-sized explosion. And indeed, everybody down there hits the deck and debris starts falling all around them. Then Len describes the last stages of Prince of Wales's action with Bismarck, and that they've broken contact at around 08:45, at which point they are relieved from action stations. He then goes up to the bridge and gets a first-hand view of just what a disaster the bridge was after that shell had come through. And he actually has quite a personal connection with what's happened up on the bridge, because one of the men up there, a chap by the name of Deeds, had actually lived on the same street as him pre-war and was now dead. And he notes that another man who died on the bridge shortly thereafter of wounds, one Able Seaman Slater, had actually been aboard HMS Hardy when she'd been lost at the Battle of Narvik the year earlier. That wraps up Prince of Wales's action at Denmark Strait, but then there's a few extra paragraphs in the letter where Len tells us about the last stages as Prince of Wales pursues Bismarck. Now, something that again gets overlooked quite a bit is that Prince of Wales and Bismarck actually exchange fire a few more times before Prince of Wales breaks off the action, and he actually notes one of these occasions. He says about 2100 hours they were sent to action stations. This is a little bit later on in the course of the pursuit. And he notes something very interesting, that they were firing using what he calls the RDF apparatus, i.e. the radar, and he notes that the RDF ratings could see on their screens every time we hit her, because he was told at the time that they'd hit Bismarck no fewer than 3 times. Now, of course, we know that historically no hits were actually scored, but a few other people aboard HMS Prince of Wales during that engagement also thought Prince of Wales had hit Bismarck. But the main note of interest here is that they're actually firing using radar. So they're actually using radar in a main gunnery control fashion in May 1941, and that the radar screens are actually showing the spike of the shells landing, and it's primarily, it seems, based on the intersection of where the shells are landing and Bismarck on the radar screen, that they're making the assessment that they've actually hit Bismarck. And we do know that the shells did come very, very close. So that probably explains the error in observation. But nonetheless, the use of gunnery radar at this early stage in the war, at a considerable range, the other sources point that the engagement is about 20,000 yards, is very, very interesting. And then one final bit of detail I thought I'd highlight for this video is that he notes that, obviously down at the pom-poms, they hear aeroplanes approaching, so they man the guns, but then they're told, basically, don't shoot them, they're friendlies, and he notes then that they are Swordfish torpedo bombers coming through. And those are, of course, the aircraft from HMS Victorious, launching the first airstrike against Bismarck. And this matches up with a historic record because the airstrike that went in on Bismarck did actually occur while Prince of Wales was still in pursuit of Bismarck. And the account wraps up with a note that Prince of Wales had actually only been at anchor in Iceland for about 2 hours when they got the message through that Bismarck had been finally hunted down and sunk by King George V and Rodney. So, those are a few highlights from this new letter, new evidence to be entered into the record of the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Of course, massive thanks to Len West for putting down his thoughts on the matter after so many years, and of course his son for sending it in for wider publication. And of course, many thanks to Britain at War magazine for reaching out to me to offer me a chance to comment first on the letter itself, and then, of course, for publishing the letter to a wider audience. Related to that, if you want to read the entirety of the letter and my commentary, then you can get the Britain at War September issue at a discount, thanks to my collaboration with them. So the link's in the description below, and there's a code as well if you want to go to their website independently. And if you think, oh, actually, sounds like a good magazine to follow, I'd like to subscribe to them, then there's also a separate link, so make sure to check the header on each link, where you can get 25% off a subscription and a free little bookazine on the Battle of Berlin when you subscribe. Obviously, that's entirely up to you, but in all seriousness, this is, as I said, brand new documentary evidence about what happened to HMS Hood at the Battle of Denmark Strait. If nothing else, go and read Len West's letter in the September issue. It's absolutely worth consideration. And so with that, we'll wrap up this video. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching and listening, and hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.